Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ACEEE webinar and happy Earth Day. I want to welcome you to today's webcast about Biden's first 100 days, efficiency and equity in climate action. It's a very apropos day, not only Earth Day, but today President Biden has just announced that the U.S. is going to be setting a target of 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and energy efficiency is going to need to play a very important role in order to help achieve that target. I'm Steve Nadell. I'm the Executive Director at ACEEE, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Our topic is the role of energy efficiency and equity in federal climate policy, and given the president's announcement, as well as all the other interest there has been this calendar year, whether it's with the new administration, with Congress, with internationally, it's a very timely time to talk about climate proposals as President Biden nears 100 days in office. Before I introduce our panel, a few announcements. All of the attendees are in listen-only mode, but can submit questions via the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screens. We will be looking at those and grouping things and picking questions to ask after the presentations are done. Also, you can download PDFs from the resource list, and you can use the chat feature to share information. And you can also customize your screen with the widgets at the bottom. And now I'd like to introduce our distinguished speakers. First to speak will be Carolyn Snyder, who's the Director of the Climate Protection Partnership Division of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Next, we have Fatima Maria Ahmad, who's a Senior Counsel to the U.S. House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And then batting cleanup will be Katie McGinty, who's the Vice President and Chief Sustainability, Government, and Regulatory Affairs Officer at Johnson Controls. So as I noted, first up is Carolyn. Prior to EPA, she served as a consultant at McKinsey & Company. She was a White House Fellow in the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, and also served as Director of Delaware's Division of Energy and Climate. She has a PhD in Environment and Resources from Stanford University. Her scientific research has been published in Nature, Paleoceanography, and Climatic Change. So, Carolyn, please, we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Stephen, and good afternoon, everyone. And I also want to wish you all a happy Earth Day. Thanks for the invitation to join this discussion. It's an honor to be part of a panel with such distinguished thought leaders, and I greatly look forward to the discussion today. First, a caveat: the views expressed by me today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I wanted to start our discussion today with reflections on how the Biden administration's climate and equity plans and proposals represent three things. One, an integrated approach to three major crises. Two, the prioritization of energy efficiency. And lastly, the leveraging of a full policy and program portfolio. Change is one of the most urgent threats facing our country, but it's also the economic opportunity of many lifetimes. From the beginning, we've seen the Biden administration identify the need for an integrated approach to address three major crises facing our nation: the climate crisis, economic recovery, and systemic injustice and inequality. In the administration's plans, equity is not a side conversation, but rather integrated into the heart of plans to tackle climate change. We know that achieving deep emissions reductions necessary to fight climate change will not be possible if we do not reach all Americans. For example, households with an annual income below $60,000 account for nearly 50% of all household energy consumption, and over 90% of households in the United States own one or more vehicles. Moreover, everyone deserves to be part of climate solutions, to access the benefits of safe, healthy, efficient, non-polluting homes, powered by clean energy, and with access to clean transportation. And these are not just aspirations. The president has set the goal that 40% of the overall benefits leadership in this area with your Leading with Equity initiative, which is developing better metrics for capturing progress towards equity-centered policies and programs. It's critical that the benefits to underserved communities are tangible and local, including affordability, jobs, improved air quality, and healthier buildings. Second, efficiency is prioritized as a critical component of climate and equity solutions. A review of climate policy research, including Steve, efficiency provides cost-effective emissions benefits. Efficiency enables an affordable transition to a decarbonized power system by lowering the amount of new clean generation needed. Efficiency makes more manageable the needed pace for building out clean energy infrastructure, buying us time for RD&D and avoiding interim bridge investments. Efficiency contributes to effective balancing of electricity generation and demand. Efficiency is more likely to create local jobs, and efficiency reduces costs and mitigates distributional energy and public health burden on underserved and long overburdened communities. And in the priorities of this administration, we see the recognition of the power of efficiency for climate and equity goals. I'll also add that quantification and effective communication of these multiple benefits of energy efficiency continue to be a critical role and a high priority for our programs at EPA. And lastly, a reflection on the leveraging of a full policy and program portfolio. As the President stated in his early executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, together we must combat the climate crisis with bold progressive action that combines the full capacity of the federal government with efforts from every corner of our nation, every level of government, and every sector of our economy. We see this in the full set of strategies being deployed so far. Regulations and standards, research and development, investments and incentives, workforce development, state and local policy support, and public-private partnerships to drive market transformation and accelerate deployment. In an all-sectors framework, we are challenged to expand the reach of our policies and programs to rapidly increase deployment in hard-to-reach sectors in every corner of our economy, including underserved communities, affordable housing, and small and medium-sized buildings, to reach millions of homes and millions of buildings across our country. And we see this in the activation and collaboration across the full federal government in a way we have never seen before. All of this together is required as we work to fulfill our new national target, as Steve mentioned, to reduce economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 50% from 2005 levels by 2030, and to reach net zero emissions economy-wide by no later than 2050. Solutions to the climate crisis present a tremendous opportunity to strengthen our economy while also making life more affordable and protecting the environment for future generations. And energy efficiency is the keystone of that story. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Carolyn. I would just remind people, if you have questions for Carolyn or any of the other speakers, use the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen, and we will ask those after all the speakers are done. Next, I'm happy to turn to Fatima Maria Ahmed for a perspective from Capitol Hill. She now works for the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, but before that, she served as the Senior Solutions Fellow at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. She was also a Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary for Fish and Wildlife and Parks, U.S. Department of Interior, and while there, she helped license 10,000 megawatts of wind, solar, and geothermal energy. She has a JD law degree from the University of Chicago Law School and was elected a Fellow of the American Bar Association in 2018. With that, Fatima, we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you, Steve, and I'm excited to be here with everyone today. It's an exciting Earth Day, probably the most exciting Earth Day of my lifetime. So as folks mentioned, we have some big announcements, and I'll get to that. But first, I wanted to just provide some background on the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. So Speaker Pelosi convened the House Select Committee last Congress. And the reason for this is that climate change touches everything, right? So it cuts across committee jurisdictions. We're going to need policy like tax policy. We're going to need public lands policy. And so that's why the Speaker created the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And our task was to share policy recommendations with the other standing committees. And I have to thank ACEEE. They were super helpful. I mean, we met with hundreds of stakeholders individually, and ACEEE played a huge role in terms of helping us convene stakeholders to talk about some of our proposed solutions and providing technical assistance. So we really appreciated it. And energy efficiency was very important to members of the Select Committee. And this is probably underreported, but actually the Climate Crisis Action Plan that we released last summer, it actually starts with energy efficiency. So the very first recommendation is national energy efficiency targets. And then the second one is reauthorizing and expanding the energy efficiency and conservation block grant program. So clearly energy efficiency was what we led with. And then in addition, equity was really important. And so we had a separate section on environmental justice that really incorporated the leading bill on environmental justice, which is the Environmental Justice for All Act, led by Chair Grijalva and Representative McEachin. But we also wove equity throughout the recommendations in the report. And anytime we recommended grant investments, we recommended prioritizing communities that need those infrastructure investments the most. And we've actually seen this now with President Biden. They have this great Justice 40 initiative, which we really commend them for. So in terms of results, many of the recommendations in our Climate Crisis Action Plan did pass the House last year, either through the House Infrastructure Bill or the House Energy Bill. So that was pretty great. And then at the end of the year, we had several recommendations enacted into law. We had a year-end omnibus bill that had important climate solutions. And so some of them are phasing down HFCs. That was pretty great. Investing in R&D for climate solutions like renewable energy, but also for the industrial sector, extending clean energy tax credits, supporting ocean climate solutions. So that was a pretty significant law when it comes to climate policy. It's probably one of the bigger bills in the last few years. So that was great. Now here we are in the 117th Congress, and our committee has been extended. We have the same mandate, which is to share policy recommendations with the other standing committees. And environmental justice has now been added to our mandate in the House rules. And we are very excited to be working with the Biden administration to advance the American Jobs Plan. So the goals here, what we're trying to do, we want to drive an equitable economic recovery. We want to accelerate deployment of clean energy and climate solutions. We want to create millions of good paying union jobs. We want to build back better. We want to create a more sustainable and resilient future. We want to manufacture the solutions here in America. That's a really critical piece. We want to develop our domestic supply chains. We saw how supply chains were threatened by the pandemic. We want to position the United States to export a lot of these climate solutions to the rest of the world. So the American Jobs Plan, pretty exciting. Efficiency plays a huge role. There's a goal of retrofitting more than 2 million homes and businesses, which is great. There is a reference to an energy efficiency and clean electricity standard. There are investments for rail, which can be more efficient than other modes of transportation. There's funding for water efficiency. That's pretty great. And then now on Earth Day, President Biden, as folks have already mentioned, announced a new target to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% from 2005 levels by 2030. That's pretty great. A number of other countries also announced new targets this morning, which is great. It's kind of showing how impactful U.S. leadership can be. And now the big question is, all right, well, how are we going to meet the target? And looking ahead, since the goal is 2030, we have to look at what we can do in the near term. And here's what Congress can do. We can certainly focus on investing in sustainable infrastructure. We can extend tax credits for climate solutions like clean energy, clean vehicles. We can do additional R&D support. There's the potential for a CES. Jennifer Granholm had mentioned that that might be something that could be possible. On the executive side of things, certainly there's an opportunity for new regulations to address greenhouse gas pollution by vehicles and fuel economy, do some more energy efficiency regulation. We can regulate non-CO2 gases. And of course, states, cities, businesses, and other actors are also going to be continuing to lead. So, where are we going to be focusing? We're going to be focusing primarily, I think, on the electricity and transportation sectors. That's where we can find the most near-term emissions reductions in the next decade. So pretty excited to be working with you all on that going forward. So let me pause there.
Okay, thank you very much, Fatima. Again, please remember, questions and answers, we're starting to get a few, but really encourage more so we can have a robust discussion and follow up on some of the things that Carolyn, Fatima, and Katie will say. And with that, let me turn next to Katie McGinty, who helps drive Johnson Controls JCI sustainability performance and promotes government policies encouraging smart buildings and energy efficiency. She has previously served as chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, was a deputy assistant to President Clinton, was Secretary of Environmental Protection for the state of Pennsylvania, and chair of the Pennsylvania Energy Development Authority. So she really has quite a distinguished career. She has a BS in chemistry, so she's a chemist by trade, but also a law degree from Columbia. So with that, please take it away, Katie.
Steve, it's great to see you again, and what an honor to be on this panel. I will tell you, powerful women for climate action, equity, and energy efficiency. It's really great to hear, and what a wonderful, wonderful day. And Steve, I do want to shout out ACAAA. You guys have been a force and have made huge positive difference. And I'll tell you now, with EPA and the action in the Congress, in addition to what the White House has been doing, terrific. Speaking about administration actions, I wanted to highlight two that I think are just extraordinary in helping to hit the ball out of the park in terms of climate action. And the two that I wanted to highlight are, number one, the linking of climate change, climate risk to the financial system. And then the second is, for us at Johnson Controls, a pure play sustainable buildings technology company, the idea that buildings are on the agenda is extraordinarily exciting to us. Coming back to the financial piece, so two reasons why I'm very encouraged to see climate risk being recognized. One, when we work on energy efficiency, you know, we're so often stuck in the basement, not in the boardroom. But when we're now talking about SEC, other financial regulatory agencies taking a look at climate risk, right away, climate energy efficiency becomes a C-suite relevant topic. That, to me, is extraordinarily important so that we move from incremental measures truly to strategic change in advancing climate solutions. And just to give you a flavor of how that works or how we see it working, we've already seen the whites of the eyes of the dramatic sea change that happens when big financial players start to take these issues very, very seriously. So when the BlackRocks and the State Streets and the Vanguards begin to judge companies on the basis of their climate action plans, what you see is that the board of directors then demand to see action plans, demand to have regular reports of progress against those commitments and plans. And in the case of Johnson Controls, we've been at this a long time. We've been a sustainability company for a long time. But you'll see many other companies like ours, where literally our CEO and our executive compensation now, is tied to meeting, in our case, our net zero by 2040 goals and our science-based targets by 2030. So that pushes the action to a whole new level. Second reason why I think that is critical is we know we need to mobilize trillions of dollars every year, and linking that climate risk to finance can unlock that private sector investment force in the direction of climate change positive actions. Now, I mentioned also buildings. So, we are always very excited to see solar, wind, electric vehicles as some of the major solution sets pointed to for climate change. But what we know is that buildings represent 40% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. Part of the reason we're thrilled to see the president's focus, as Fatima said, on buildings as well, pointing to 2 million buildings, really critical that we start making those buildings much more efficient, bring renewables and grid edge energy resources, and drive those buildings to net zero. One major policy tool that I would love to see more action around from the administration in the short term is let's get going now with federal buildings, with an executive order that directs those federal agencies dramatically to cut energy consumption using performance contracts, so that there's no need to ask Congress for a whole lot more money to get the job done. We can mobilize those private sector resources, guarantee the energy results to get done. And now we know with digital technologies like our Open Blue and others, we can drive buildings to net zero with significant savings. So I think the administration's off to an extraordinary start. I think that it is a game changer to link climate risk to the financial system and begin to drive those regulations. And I think it's great that buildings are in the game so that we can cut that 40% of emissions that derives from the built environment. Thanks, Steve. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Katie, and thanks to all of our panelists. Again, we have a number of questions, but it's not too late. You can continue to enter questions as this discussion goes on. To kick things off, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, then we will turn to questions from the audience. For my first question for each of the panelists, I would note that the president has taken, as well as proposed, a variety of actions to address our climate crisis. What, in your opinion, might be flying under the radar? What do you think is not getting enough coverage and attention, but is a priority? And why do you think so? And I want to make clear, each of the panelists are speaking for themselves and not necessarily speaking for their employers. So who would like to go first with this one?
I'm happy to start. So I think that one thing that has been flying under the radar is how important energy efficiency is going to be. So we talked about some of the targets that were in the American Jobs Plan, but I'm not sure that that was really covered in the press as much. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that I think people often assume that all of the cost-effective energy savings opportunities that are out there have already been taken advantage of. And we've heard a member on our committee used to tell this joke, two economists walk down the street, one of them sees a $20 bill and the other one says, it can't be. If it was really there, somebody would have taken it already. So I think that's one reason it flies under the radar. The other, I think, is that energy efficiency cuts across lots of different sectors, and people in the climate policy world tend to specialize in either electricity or transportation, and efficiency is something that cuts across. And so I think that's another reason it's not getting that much attention. The other thing is that there's huge health benefits of climate action, right? If we cut down the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, we're also probably going to be cleaning up our air and water. And one thing is right now we're in the middle of a pandemic, and there is research that shows that exposure to air pollution can actually increase your vulnerability to severe impacts of COVID, including death. And so, as a result of that, as a result of all of the childhood asthma we are seeing a lot more advocacy from the medical profession directly. And so recently, a whole group of public health associations, including the American Association of Pediatrics and others, they all wrote to President Biden asking for ambitious action on climate change because climate action can improve our air and water quality and our food quality, according to recent research. So those are some of the things that I think are not being reported as much.
Okay, great. Thank you. One of our other speakers want to go next?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in because I want to pick up on the great story that Fatima told. So here's a counter story to the notion that all the energy efficiency has already been done. Stunning experience during COVID, obviously in any number of ways, but with respect to energy efficiency, so here are the statistics. On average in commercial buildings, we saw about an 80% reduction in occupancy in those buildings. As we all know, we're working remotely. Even though 80% reduction in occupancy, 10 to 20% on average reduction in energy consumption. And the reason for that is because those buildings are the opposite of efficient, number one, but number two, and specific, Steve, to your point, what's flying under the radar, we really need mandates for smart buildings, for grid interactive and flexible buildings. The reason those buildings run when there's nobody in them is because mostly they only have an on switch and an off switch. And as Texas showed us, bad things happen when we switch buildings off, right? So we need digital capability so that we can have many more opportunities to optimize the performance of buildings, number one. The other reason I think that we got to get smart buildings, and it was great to have some pilots in the recently passed energy bill out from under the radar, is for this critical reason. I mentioned the 40% of greenhouse gases that are from buildings. So just like vehicles, we have to decarbonize buildings. To decarbonize buildings, we've got to electrify them. But if we electrify buildings just straight out, that is like 5 United States' almost worth of natural gas-fired energy in hot water and space heating that overnight gets dumped on a grid that's not up for the job. Buildings enable us to dial down the load of those buildings so that we can electrify them and then have those buildings become a grid resource and grid balancing resource rather than a burden on the grid. So my vote is for let's bring smart buildings to the fore, and let's make it so that buildings themselves and all of the equipment have to be smart ready and grid bi-directionally communicatable.
Okay, thanks. Yes, we're all in favor of smart as opposed to dumb buildings. Okay, Carolyn.
Yeah, I really echo the thoughts from both Fatima and Katie. One element I would kind of add is around the improvements we've seen with heat pump technology. I think there's more to be done, but we're seeing heat pumps provide a promising solution for increasing efficiency. But as we were just hearing, and also, that efficient electrification of previously fossil fuel fired end uses is another critical strategy for both buildings and homes. And at Energy Star, we've been working on new program requirements to create for the residential setting a cold climate designation to help consumers and contractors easily identify equipment optimized for low outside temperatures, which has been a serious barrier in the past. These requirements will help ensure that these heat pumps have the capacity to efficiently provide a comfortable level of heat, even when it is very cold out, and avoid the need for less efficient and often higher emitting backup heating. The new specifications from Energy Star also address issues associated with equipment installation and maintenance, again, issues that can undermine the expected efficiency savings and comfort. And to give a sense of scale, if all heat pumps, central air conditioners, and electric water heaters, residential products sold in the United States met these new Energy Star levels, the energy cost savings would grow to $11 billion a year and 255 billion pounds of annual greenhouse gas emissions prevented. And these requirements are part of a broader EPA initiative to accelerate emissions reductions and help generate local jobs through increased efficiency and beneficial electrification working together. and deploying our approach of a market transformation strategy, leveraging partnerships with thousands of companies and organizations across the U.S., as well as consumer education. And I'm very excited about the multiple opportunities across the federal government to leverage the opportunities of advances in heat pump technology, but also hand in hand with smart technology to manage the grid impacts. And that, again, with an all-of-government approach, that we're thinking about all of those strategies together, not independently. As well as, I think we're in earlier stages of quantifying the co-benefits to indoor public health, as well as other elements. So I think those are all very promising developments coming.
Yes, great, thank you. And then just to follow up slightly, I would note that, Carolyn, you talked about heat pumps. Katie was talking about smart buildings. Fatima was talking about many different things. Just yesterday, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, Ron Wyden, introduced a major reform of energy efficiency tax incentives, including for commercial buildings that might include smart buildings, but also including some enhanced incentives for heat pumps. And my understanding, and Fatima might comment later, the House is working on something somewhat similar. So those are examples of the types of things. I'm not saying, well, we just have to wait for the federal government to pay for everything, but these things can help work with the markets, work with the Johnson Controls, the EPAs, and everybody else to help make some of these things happen. With that, why don't I ask a second question for each of you, that you all in your remarks commented in various ways on the importance of equity. As the U.S. works to develop climate solutions, we need to address the needs of all Americans. My question is, what is one high priority step that we should be sure to undertake in order to really serve all Americans? And again, these are personal opinions and not for your employers. We have a, go ahead, Katie. Huh?
Okay,
No?
I'll kick us off this time. First of all, I am just so grateful that this whole dimension to the sustainability equation, the people part, is getting the kind of spotlight that is long overdue and deserved. And certainly COVID pointed up a lot of things, but the social inequities in this country and in the world are among them. So it's a privilege to have a chance to talk about this subject. You know, I guess I want to take a play on the word equity, because I kind of like the equity approach to needing to be equitable. And what I mean by that, not to be cute, is I don't think it's good enough to just minimize the negative impacts. I don't think it's good enough to just pay after the fact for imposition that might have been imposed. I'm all about seat at the table and making sure, as we are building new infrastructure, that there is genuine ownership, and that communities that are going to be the hosts, for example, of that infrastructure are at the table and not just get to write some comments, but they have a share of the action, and so that they are able to make some of the decisions. And I think there's some very promising examples of this, including in DC, where there's some structures being put together that would enable third-party mediators, for example, to be used to help build ownership committees at the local level, to structure actually the partnership agreements, the board agreements, and all of the rights and responsibilities there. I think that's extraordinarily important. The other thing, just to draw from Johnson Controls' experience, you know, we shoot for 100% women and minority-owned business participation in all of our projects. And here's what we find. We find that in many instances, there is a lack of financial capital, and there's a lack of training capital for those businesses to be able to expand and be able to participate fully in a job that might be won. And so we as a company then stand up labs to help to impart those skills. So I think, one, let's use performance contracting In that, let's create some ownership structures with the local communities, and let's call on the participants in the projects to invest in the skills development, the human capital, the financial capital to ensure that there's full and thorough women and minority-owned business participation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katie. And Fatima, you were ready to go last time. Kind of reminds me of a game of Jeopardy, so I'll let you go next.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think Katie is exactly right. And someone had asked me once, what is the difference between environmental equity and environmental justice? And I said, the way I look at it is justice, has to do with addressing the legacy of pollution in the past, but equity also has to deal with the upside, right? The benefits of clean energy. And in fact, my boss, Chair Kathy Castor, who chairs the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, today she introduced a bill on community solar. And that's exciting too, because that's an opportunity to increase access to clean energy for everyone, regardless of whether or not they have their own rooftop, whether they live in a multifamily apartment building, whether they're renters, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of creative solutions. The reason I kind of hesitated originally is like there's so many good options. I was like not sure which one to pick. But I think honestly, one of the most important steps is the Justice 40 initiative, where President Biden has committed now to making sure that 40% of the benefits of infrastructure investments go to environmental justice communities. That's really important. I think the new screening tool that they're creating, I think it's called Equity Screen, is going to be really interesting, building on EPA's existing EJ Screen tool. That's also really important. There's been a lot of really interesting legal thinking around cumulative impacts and how to make sure we're not creating unbearable levels of pollution in communities. So, I mean, there's so many important things that we can do right now. There's a lot of creative thinking going on in this space, but I think making sure that environmental justice communities have a seat at the table is probably the most critical step to make sure all of these great ideas can be carried out.
Great, thank you. And Carolyn?
So Katie and Fatima did a great job covering so many important topics. I'll focus a bit on the challenge for homes. And, to achieve these climate goals, we're going to need to upgrade almost every home in America. We've heard of these targets of several million homes. And I'll start by saying I'm a huge fan of the Weatherization Assistance Program. I had the honor to have one of my first experiences in government helping lead that program for the state of Delaware. And it's really great to see proposals around significant increases of funding for that program. But we need more. We need to upgrade not just tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of homes, but millions of homes a year. And I'm really inspired by these innovative emerging models that have found success at how do we expand the scale of efficiency deployment in underserved and overburdened communities. And organizations like Block Power and inclusive financing approaches like Pay As You Save are two examples. And we've spent a fair amount of time at EPA reflecting on how could Energy Star be a more useful contributor to that challenge? And how do we find a way to have a complementary program design to the traditional home upgrade program that can get at the most important measures to make these homes healthier, safer, and less polluting, but in a more streamlined approach that's more accessible to more households and has less administration costs. And we're working on a new program that we'll be launching this fall called the Energy Star Home Upgrade that's built around the premise you don't need an upfront audit to know there's millions of households that have most likely 6 important things to do. Install a smart thermostat. We've heard about that importance of being responsive to grid management. Seal and insulate your attic. Switch to a heat pump for heating and cooling and for water heating. Upgrade your windows. And if applicable, make your home EV charger ready. And we're exploring a way to have these measures leverage the existing Energy Star third-party certification, installers, and the value we now have of this connected data resource, that we could have confidence in savings and find a way to offer greater accessibility without compromise in integrity, without the individual household site visits and other heavy administrative burdens. And our hope is to find a way to reach that ambitious target of millions of homes a year. And of course, a streamlined approach isn't enough to adequately address the challenge of how are we going to be far more successful in reaching underserved communities. But we believe it's a critical component. And we'll be working on how do we expand innovative program delivery designs, like I previously mentioned, such as Pay As You Save or Block Power. And we look forward to working with our partners to challenge all of us who are working in the energy efficiency space of we don't need to do somewhat better. We need to rapidly scale our ability to deploy efficiency investments in underserved communities. We need to find a way to bring these smart solutions that improve people's lives, make their homes safer for their family, as well as the health of our planet. And I'm really excited to see the growing innovation around that space.
Very good. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, all three of you. I'm now going to turn to some questions for the audience. And I would like at least one person to answer each question. And if more of you want to answer it, that's fine, but there's no need for everybody to answer every question. So first question comes from Jackie Bauer from Rent Lab, who asks, Congress continues to be gridlocked. Any prospect for bipartisan climate bills to get passed?
Oh, sure. I mean, in fact, we did see a bipartisan climate bill get passed last year at the end of the year with the omnibus package. That was actually probably one of the most significant climate bills we've seen in a long time. And as I mentioned, we had an agreement to phase down HFCs, super pollutants. We also agreed on new authorizations for R&D for climate solutions across multiple sectors. And we extended clean energy tax credits. And so, during our hearings, the areas where we've seen some bipartisan interest are number one, innovation. So that explains why there was such an innovation focus in that year-end package. Number two, paying farmers to store carbon in their soils. And we saw, I think earlier this week, there were some announcements about some ideas around agriculture. And then number three, on resilience, we saw definitely an interest in making sure that we're prepared for all of the extreme weather and other impacts of climate change that we're already starting to see. So definitely, I think there's some opportunity. And of course, now we're focused on this infrastructure investment. I think everyone can see we badly need investment in America's infrastructure. You've seen those report cards from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Repeatedly, we've seen that there's a huge need for investment. And coming out of this pandemic, there's a huge need to invest in economic recovery, create a lot of new jobs. So I think polls show that Americans support clean energy and climate solutions. They support the government taking this crisis head on. And so I think, I think there's a huge opportunity this year to get it done.
Very good. And the second part of that question was, is there more that can be done using existing laws without waiting for Congress to pass new laws? Someone want to take that?
Well, I'll chime in a little bit here. So I touched on some of these tools that we have before, but the power of performance contracting, for example, I mean, the Biden administration has the chance to do what, as vice president, the president had done with President Obama, which is through executive orders and directing the upgrade of federal facilities. We saw billions and billions of dollars of savings in terms of energy costs and just extraordinary improvement in the performance of the federal fleet. However, still lots of those $20 bills still on the ground and to be deployed. I think that's an extraordinarily important tool. And I do want to also underscore what Fatima said. With tools like the 179D program, which incentivize energy efficiency in commercial buildings, having been made permanent, that too was extraordinary, and I think can put a lot of wind in the sails of seeing accelerated upgrade of commercial properties as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think President Biden and his team are going to use absolutely every authority that they have to fight the climate crisis. There's a lot of creative thinking leading up to inauguration, and now there's this all-star team in the administration that's going to carry it out. We've seen some really promising signs already. We saw those executive orders, and they included a goal to get the entire federal government running on 100% clean electricity and eventually 100% clean fuels for the vehicles. And so that's a huge market mover right there. That sends a really powerful signal to the markets. And I definitely agree with Katie 100% on maxing out those energy performance savings contracts. It's a great idea. And so I think there's a lot the federal government can do, especially under existing laws over at EPA. Of course, they're going to, I think, move forward on a lot of new regulations, including for CO2, but also non-CO2 gases as well. So, I think there's a lot that can be done.
Great.
I would just echo, I really, sorry.
I'll let you quickly reply, and then I'll move on to the next one.
Sure, thanks. I was going to echo, I think the power of the federal government's procurement footprint is massive. And the point of not just setting ambitious targets, but an opportunity to bridge the gap between R&D and massive deployment, because there are some really important challenges to work out, but being able to leverage the federal government, we've got a great history of success, and there's just so much more I think we can do there. And one other piece, in addition to the comments already mentioned with our existing, I think, regulatory authorities and our experience with doing partnership programs to leverage far more from the private sector than we will do with regulatory work alone. One other piece, which I think is a large value that the federal government can provide, and sometimes loses a bit momentum when we have a government like the administration we have now, is the role of state and local policy and the value in the various ways that the strong federal government can support and enable state and local policy and help rapidly scale it. One example in the building space is building benchmarking and transparency laws, and emerging focus on building performance standards. And all of those policies, the backbone of those policies is the Energy Star portfolio manager, and EPA and DOE provide extensive technical assistance. And that's just one example. So I think that's another tool in the federal toolkit, even though it is related to state and local jurisdiction. And I think a similar analogy to the amazing messaging this morning around the way the federal government can also help international action as well.
Yeah, and actually my boss is also working on a benchmarking bill for commercial buildings. So we're really excited about that.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to switch gears slightly, and a question from Kathy Hooboom, sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, from Intel. She asks, while we look to drive major reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in the short term with current low-hanging fruit, what groundwork is being laid at the same time to enable the mid to longer term reductions that will be needed?
I'm happy to start. I think if we want to get to our 2030 targets, we're going to be really focusing on electricity and transportation, because that's where a lot of the near-term opportunities are. But to get to our 2050 targets, we're going to have to figure out what to do about buildings. That's going to be maxing out efficiency, but it's also going to be electrification. We're also going to have to tackle the industrial sector, figure out how to deal with those process emissions, and figure out some alternatives or solutions for heavy-duty trucking, for off-road transportation. A lot of creative thinking happening right now about sustainable aviation fuels, what to do about shipping. So I think there's a lot of interest right now in figuring out how to handle those long-term challenges too.
I would add, I think the framework for efficiency has shifted. It's not about one and done. And as Katie mentioned, we learned a lot from the pandemic. In some cases, really unfortunate lost opportunities of savings. In other cases where leadership found significant efficient savings relative to other buildings or companies. And the frame that we're not talking about efficiency in this one chunk. It's year over year meeting across the entire sector savings on the order of 1% to 2%. And the fact that that is an iterative, continuous process that we need to commit to and not lose momentum, not lose energy in, I think it is a critical player in that as well.
One of the things I'd add to all of this, Steve, and to the person who raised the question, when you think of medium term, to me, I went to the kind of gigaton plays And that raised for me, not necessarily breakthrough new technologies, but honestly, just the walls that we put into, or the hurdles to building that new infrastructure. And I really do commend, I know the administration is looking at some of those permitting challenges and seeing where things can be streamlined. I would love to see some kind of deal, where the greener, the more decarbonizing the infrastructure is, the sort of better easy pass it gets, and vice versa. And I don't know if we can do that, but we just can't have a situation where it takes 10 years to build the infrastructure we need, because Mother Nature's not going to give us that much time to get this right.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. I mean, I think the administration has a lot of existing tools it can use. I mean, when President Obama was in office, the FAST Act was enacted. There's a dashboard. There's a way to expedite coordination between federal agencies on projects. I think it's true we need to figure out how to modernize how we review some of these applications. But, sometimes I feel like it is tossed out as a bit of a red herring in terms of the challenges that we face. I think it's a solvable problem. And, we saw in the Obama administration, Steve mentioned earlier, one of the things I worked on is Secretary Salazar set a goal of licensing 10,000 megawatts of wind, solar, and geothermal on public lands during his first term. That goal came from the Energy Policy Act, but he set a goal of getting it done in his first term. And, we found ways to do it. There was a solar programmatic EIS, to try to take this sort of smart from the start siting approach. So, I think it is definitely something that can be done. I think it's within the resources of the existing administration, and I feel confident they'll address that challenge.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, here's another question. JCI recently signed a letter with a lot of other major companies urging the Biden administration to take bold climate action. For Carolyn and Fatima, how important will this business support be in taking executive action or passing legislation? For Katie, will the corporate tent continue to enlarge, and why are some companies holding back?
I'm happy to start. I think it is hugely significant. I mean, we've seen in the last 10 days or so a lot of letters of support for an ambitious nationally determined contribution. So one of the letters, just as an example, was from the We Mean Business Coalition. It was over 300 companies and investors. And those types of signals from these huge companies really show that the private sector is already heading in this direction. And what we need to do is harness this private capital and unleash it so that it can help us fight the climate crisis. But it's hugely significant when companies state these public pledges in support of ambitious climate policy.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And I'll add, I think it's all the more powerful today because of what those companies are doing on their own. If we look at voluntary green power purchasing, that's above and beyond current regulatory requirements, the scale of that in the United States is now approaching the scale of all state policies combined. And that level of commitment, we heard from Katie earlier around science-based target commitments and net zero commitments. So having these companies lead and push the way, as well as sign these letters of support or express in these different instances, I think is all the more powerful for that reason.
Yeah, I mean, I echo all of what has been said, and I guess I'll also maybe take the spirit of the question, which I think is very insightful, and sort of confess that it is true that Johnson Controls has been in the sustainability business for a long time. We've been actually reporting sustainability against our emissions, et cetera, for more than 20 years. So you might say, well, geez, are we an outlier? And most companies are not heading, in this kind of direction. And I guess the two things I would say, on the one hand, a game changer, again, that is definitely bringing many, many, many more companies into the sustainability fold is this focus by the financial community. The fact that BlackRock took action against the management of 53 plus companies that's something that a lot of companies are paying attention to and changing their calculus as to whether they need to care about this or get in the game. The other thing, though, is just legitimate. It's a kind of, geez, how do I get there? And there's a cacophony of kind of yardsticks and standards, and people find it very confusing. They also wonder, do I have the upfront capital to make the changes? And two things there that I hope can help me move the needle is, if we see a real stick and stay, that the administration is moving, financial community is insisting on action, there are companies like ours that are stepping up to offer kind of end-to-end services to say, we know that this is an alphabet soup, TCFD, SASB, CDP, and we know it's, geez, how do you get the net zero? But to offer that end-to-end, to provide the upfront financing, and actually to guarantee the result and not get paid if you don't achieve it for people. So I think as those solutions come into the market, as people like Fatima and Carolyn with the administration continue to drive and make it clear, this isn't going away, folks. This is the new and promising reality. Then I think the solution sets will come to enable more people to feel that they can jump in and that it wouldn't be like such a courageous act to jump in. It's just another service they buy.
Okay. We have a number of questions about heat pumps and electrification, and I'll attempt to paraphrase several of them. How important is electrification in the short term as opposed to laying the groundwork over the medium term? And do we try to install heat pumps now, or do we need to first do more work with energy efficiency to reduce loads before we get the heat pumps? Any opinions on that set of questions?
I'll jump in from a deployment challenge. Oh, sorry. Building the momentum, I think, is critical. We don't have time to wait. And I think there is also an element of looking at the turnover. So when we look in industrial settings where there's some opportunities, this isn't specifically on heat pumps, but on electrification, for partial electrification of certain processes, the timing and ability to make that pencil out for a given facility very much depends on the natural turnover time of the equipment. And so the idea of waiting and doing it all at once at a later time just doesn't get the scale we need to get. And I'll also say that having this, we've been doing significant assessments of what the emissions implications are today, because that's a very important discussion, and what the spatial patterns of those would be and the effect on certain communities, as well as looking at, as that's happening, and at the same time that we're also focusing on lower carbon and lower polluting electricity sources. So I think it is very important to have a thoughtful discussion on safe and healthy and just transition when you're switching fuels. So there's a lot of analysis and important policy discussion to be had. But from what we've been able to see, I think we won't be able to achieve the deployment fast enough now that would trigger that discussion given the need.
I'll just add, my impression is that it seems to vary regionally. In some places, you might be able to switch to electrification now. In colder climates, it might be more difficult. But I just want to underscore, I think, what Katie had mentioned, that what we really hope to accomplish down the road is going to be, maxing out efficiency. We want the electrification. We want grid-connected buildings. So we want all of those strategies to be deployed. And it seems like it just might be easier in some places now compared to other places later.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. In cold climates, we probably need some dual fuel strategy. But to me, this is low-hanging fruit now. This piece of the equation is one of the maybe only pieces of the climate solution set that pays for itself. I mean, the efficiency gains and the economic savings from those gains, are extraordinary. We do need policy signals because people kind of ignore this piece of the equation. I just so love building performance standards. I would love to see something of the federal flavor of that. But these projects, we could get incredible, to Carolyn's point, momentum now with just some additional policy signals, because the economics of so many of these projects work. And the heat pump technology, again, cold climate, you might need dual fuel, but otherwise the heat pump technology is there and we're ready to go.
Okay, great. We've hit the end of our time. I'm sure we can keep going for another half hour. I wanted to thank all of our panelists. I also want to tell the audience that there will be a recording of this whole event posted relatively shortly. You'll each receive an email about that. But thank you all. Appreciate the discussion, and may everybody, both our panelists and everybody else, have a great rest of Earth Day as we continue our efforts and take it to a higher level that we can talk about next year. So thank you very much, everyone.